And still I rise, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful for the time, the opportunity to share some of my thoughts, my views about crucial issues, to share them not only with my colleagues here in Congress, but also with the people of our great country. And still I rise today to talk about Juneteenth. I believe Juneteenth is a very special time in the history of our country. And I'd like to say a few words about Juneteenth, but I'd also like to talk about Slavery Remembrance Day. So for those of you who are tuning in, please know that I will speak about Juneteenth, I will speak about Slavery Remembrance Day, but I'll also speak about a day that occurred before Juneteenth. As you know, President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st of 1863. But prior to signing the Emancipation Proclamation, President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Act of 1862. April 16, 1862, the date it was signed. And this is an important piece of legislation because the Emancipation Act impacted Washington, D.C., the Emancipation Act. The Emancipation Act would accord compensation for slaves that were freed, human beings held in bondage, human beings that had been kidnapped likely, or they may have been born into slavery. Some people were born into slavery, lived their entire lives, and died as slaves. But human beings, the genesis of which was persons who were kidnapped from the continent of Africa for our purposes today as we talk about slavery here in the United States, kidnapped, brought to this country, sold, forced to work, forced to be separated from their families, children sold at the auction block, went to one plantation, mother and father to another. This is what slavery was about: kidnapping, rape, murder. These are true words, words that we don't like to hear because in this country we have reviled the enslaved and revered the enslavers. But let's go back to the Emancipation Act of 1862, which impacted Washington, D.C., as I indicated. This act was to free slaves. It would free them, and it brought with it compensation. One would ordinarily believe, a reasonable and prudent person would believe that the compensation would be accorded the slave, the person who had been working at the mercy of a person known as a master. Slaves had masters. And this act, one would assume, would compensate the slave upon the slave being freed. Not so, my dear friends, not so. The Emancipation Act of 1862 compensated the master, the person who owned the slave, received compensation for allowing a person to have the liberty that God has accorded all of his children. Some have been denied the liberty, but it was a birthright for every person ever born, the right to be free. This act of trying as best as he could, President Lincoln, to free slaves, accorded persons who owned them approximately $300. $300. But before the $300 was presented, as it were, there was a slave owner who came and actually appraised slaves. They were considered chattels, property. They were appraised, and owners received this compensation. Sort of like compensating the kidnapper who kidnaps a person, compensating this person for the act of kidnapping. Release the person you kidnapped and you can receive compensation. The bank robber, bringing the ill-gotten gains back to the bank and being rewarded for bringing the ill-gotten gains back after having robbed the bank. Similar to this, only more horrific, of course, because we're talking about human beings. So we have this situation where persons who were enslaved in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, enslaved right here in Washington, D.C., when they were released, they received the opportunity to fend for themselves. They were released to the winds and the rains and the weather and elements, not given any compensation for their labor, for the crime against humanity. Slavery was one of the greatest crimes ever committed against humanity. Committed for centuries, I might add. It's a crime against humanity that has never been properly addressed. Even to this day, people don't want to hear this message. There are people who literally cannot tolerate hearing the message because they have been indoctrinated to believe that the enslaved people somehow were wrong and the enslavers were heroes. Well, this didn't work so well. Emancipation for consideration to be accorded the enslavers didn't work so well. Hence, we find that President Lincoln did, in fact, issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which was issued to free the enslaved persons who were a part of the states that left the Union. They were said to have been given their freedom, but that didn't work too well for the people who were enslaved, because in states like Texas, the enslavers didn't really honor the Emancipation Proclamation. There are some who say, well, they didn't know. Well, they did. But in Texas, they chose not to honor it. And some more than 2 years and a half later, General Gordon Granger came to Galveston, Texas, to inform the people of Texas that the persons that were being held, and this was after the end of the Civil War, I might add, the persons that were being held, to inform them that they had been liberated, and to tell the holders, the masters, the enslavers, that these human beings had to be released. But General Gordon Granger was an intelligent man. He did not come by himself. He had the good sense to know that the people of Texas were not likely to find his words with favor, that they were not likely to see and look upon what he was about to do with favor. So General Gordon Granger, understanding that Texans spoke a specific kind of language, and as a result of understanding Texas speak, General Gordon Granger concluded that he would bring some translators with him, persons who would be understood by Texans. Well, I say persons. They weren't really persons, but these were instrumentalities, if you will, that Texans would understand. So he brought with him the Coats. He brought with him the Smiths and Wessons and the Winchesters. They spoke a language that Texans understood. But before General Gordon Granger arrived, a wonderful thing occurred. It is said about a week before he arrived, they sent in the 25th Corps. The 25th Corps consisted of about 1,000 or more persons, and there was a 25th Corps that came in and ran the rebels out of Galveston, chased them to the border of the country, the boundaries, chased them all the way to Mexico. It was the 25th Corps that paved the way for General Gordon Granger to come into Texas and to issue his General Order Number 3. But here's what history doesn't say enough about. The 25th Corps consisted of black men. Somehow we don't choose to celebrate and these black men who actually were the liberators, who came in before General Gordon Granger, came into Texas, fought fiercely to liberate the black people in Texas. General Gordon Granger appeared with his General Order Number 3, accompanied by a lot of firepower, about 2,000 military personnel with him. And as a result, slaves in Texas were free to work for their masters. Imagine that. Person that has held you in slavery now becomes your boss, your employer is the way it was stated, but your boss, your employer. Your slave master is now your employer. Well, that didn't work well for the enslaved persons. This was followed with a series of laws that caused black people to have to serve time and become slaves by another name. Convict leasing is what it was called. Because we had these black codes, these laws that would require persons to work, and if you didn't work, you could be arrested, and then you could be leased to a plantation owner. In Houston, Texas, just outside, actually, in a sugar land, there's a grave with about 95 common bodies having been buried in it, called the Sugar Land 95. These persons served as slaves under a different title. But the point is, we had the Emancipation Proclamation. We had the enforcement of it by virtue of General Gordon Granger coming into Galveston, Texas. And then we had other circumstances that were unpleasant for people of color. All of these things are things that we should take note of. I think we should actually celebrate the persons who came in the 25th. I plan to introduce a resolution. I plan to introduce a resolution to honor these persons, the 25th Corps. Plan to introduce legislation so that they can be properly honored. Now, I know that there are people who hear me say these things, and sometimes they decide that, well, I think I'll do it first. Well, go ahead. I'll still have the original. It is something that we ought to do to celebrate Juneteenth, but also to commemorate the lives of the persons that suffered under slavery, commemorate them and celebrate on Juneteenth. But quite frankly, I believe we ought to do that, and I am going to do it. I've supported Juneteenth. I've supported Al Edwards, who's the father of Juneteenth. Al Edwards, a state representative out of Houston, the father of Juneteenth. He was the person who, as a freshman state representative in Texas, managed to get the impossible done. The impossible. We're talking about Texas now. He managed to get Texans in the state legislature, that would be the House and the Senate, and the governor to sign a law causing Juneteenth to become a holiday in the state of Texas. It's a miracle. Al Edwards, Juneteenth. He managed to get it become the first in the entire country, the first state in the entire country to recognize Juneteenth, June 19th, as a holiday. Al Edwards, the father of Juneteenth. Unfortunately, not a lot has been said about Al being the father of Juneteenth, but I'll be filing a resolution in this House honoring him as the father of Juneteenth. We ought to do these things. We ought to tell the truth. This is history. And obviously, a person who is the very first to file a piece of legislation that becomes law, that eventually permeates and becomes the law in other states, and now in the United States. But it was Al Edwards. He's the father of Juneteenth. So I'll be filing that resolution as well, and other legislation. I seem to have become the person whose mission in life it is to right these wrongs. And I plan to do it with my colleagues, many of whom will support what we're trying to do. I thank them, all of them who sign on to these pieces of legislation. So we have Juneteenth to celebrate the lives of those who were freed and commemorate the day and those who didn't get the opportunity to be liberated. Because you see, liberating those who were still alive is a wonderful thing to do. But we still really and truly must commemorate the lives of those who were not alive on June 19th, 1865. Their lives have to be remembered and respected. In this country, we have days of remembrance. We have a day of remembrance for 9/11, a day of remembrance for the bombing of Pearl Harbor, a Holocaust Remembrance Day, and this House, in just last year, passed a Remembrance Day for slavery, Slavery Remembrance Day. And it was done by this House of Representatives, and I must tell you, Mr. Steny Hoyer, I will never forget, nor will I let others forget the role that he played. It was Mr. Hoyer that assisted me, or perhaps I ended up assisting him. It was my legislation, but legislation that Mr. Hoyer helped get through this House. He took, as it were, the proverbial bull by the horns, and he helped this congressperson pass this legislation. So, Mr. Hoyer, wherever you are, I thank you and want you to know that at some point we would like to honor you for what you did to make real Slavery Remembrance Day in the House of Representatives. The bill did not pass the Senate, but Ms. Warren, the senator, Senator Warren, had legislation in the Senate to honor the enslaved people. It was to commemorate their lives as well. So Slavery Remembrance Day passed the House. And on August the 20th of last year, we actually commemorated, because Slavery Remembrance Day deals with solemnity and commemoration, not celebration. We celebrate on Juneteenth and commemorate, but Slavery Remembrance Day is for commemoration, not celebration. because we want to commemorate the lives that were lost to slavery. The lives of people who were born into slavery, lived their lives as slaves, many of them, and died as slaves. I heard somebody repeat that just recently. It's a wonderful thing to hear people repeat that. One of my colleagues did, and I appreciated hearing that being repeated. But Slavery Remembrance Day is about solemnity, and there's a ceremony that we have reminding us that we must always remember. This ceremony requires that a person talk about the various things that occurred, and at some point would say we must, and those who are in attendance would say always remember, because we must always remember. Slavery Remembrance Day, August 20th of last year, the first, we had over 1,000 people to show up on short notice. We plan to have it again in Houston, Texas, and in other places as well. Slavery Remembrance Day, a day for us to commemorate the lives of those who were enslaved in this country for centuries, I might add, centuries. It wasn't just some short period of time. I think many people assume that slavery occurred for maybe a few months or a few years, perhaps a decade, maybe several decades, but no, my dear friends, it was centuries, centuries that our country, the country that I love, the country where I say the Pledge of Allegiance, the country where I sing the national anthem, it was in this country, my country, that we enslaved people for centuries. But it's also in this country, my country, where we decline to this day to respect the people who were enslaved. We respect the enslavers. We've named schools after the enslavers, Lehighs across the country. We respect the enslavers. We name military bases after them. Bragg, Braxton Bragg. We name bases after them, schools after them, but not the enslaved. Somehow there seems to be this belief that the enslaved persons must have been wrong in some way. What was their wrong? What did they do to cause this country to demean them to this day? I stand here in the House of Representatives of the Congress of the United States of America to say that this country has got to respect the lives of those that were sacrificed so that it could have the riches that it has today. The economic foundation that we stand on today was put in place by enslaved people. They were the economic foundational mothers and fathers of this country, and they ought to be at least respected. At minimum, they should be respected. They ought to be respected to the same extent that we have respected the enslavers. Because in 1956, this is the conscience agenda. In 1956, the Congress of the United States of America, I have the second item on the conscience agenda. In 1956, the Congress of the United States of America honored Confederate soldiers with a Congressional Gold Medal. A Congressional Gold Medal for the enslavers. A Congressional Gold Medal for the persons who fought to keep persons in bondage and disrespect for the enslaved. No dignity accorded them. As a matter of fact, in Texas, there was a movement afoot to call slavery, to rename it, to style it as involuntary relocation. Involuntary relocation, theft of human beings, kidnapping, rape, murder, involuntary relocation. Let's just sanitize it rather than show persons the dignity and respect that they have earned by virtue of the suffering and the pain that we inflicted upon them so that this country could become the great nation that it is. How sad it is to know that members of this House refuse to this day to show them the dignity and respect that human beings deserve after having been enslaved for centuries. The House is a symbol of national shame, just as the Richard Russell office building is, by the way. I'll say more about that perhaps in a moment or two, but we are a symbol of national shame. And if anybody thinks that I'm going to cease to say this, you are entirely wrong, because it's the truth. We ought to do for the enslaved persons what we did for the Confederate soldiers in 1956. We ought to accord a Congressional Gold Medal to them. We should, but we won't. We won't. We have the power to do it. We did it for the Confederate soldiers. But we lack something else that we don't have to do it. The integrity. Takes integrity to do this. Don't have the integrity to do it. By the way, this circumstance is not something that is unknown to members, because I have circulated the request for the dear colleague, the request for persons to sign on and help us acquire the signatures necessary to accord the enslaved persons who built the country, planted the seeds, harvested the crops, fed the nation, the enslaved persons, accord them a Congressional Gold Medal. My colleagues are aware. So it's nothing new that I'm saying. But it takes integrity. It takes integrity. It takes being a person of goodwill to do this. Sad to say, we cannot get 290 persons of goodwill. 290 people. All you have to do is sign a piece of paper, and we can then move forward with the process to present a Congressional Gold Medal to the enslaved people. Sign your name. That's all. Not going to happen. Hasn't happened so far. I don't mean to sound pessimistic, I'm just realistic. Not happening. I hope that there will be a change in the hearts of members so that we can do this. I pray for a change in the hearts. Hasn't happened so far. It takes a person with integrity, a person of goodwill, a person who understands the wrong that has to be corrected, that has to be righted, and we can do it. So I'm going to ask my colleagues to do again for the enslaved persons what we did in 1956 for the enslavers. We have shown that we revere the enslavers and revile the enslaved. We don't consider them heroes. I was at the Museum of the Bible just recently with a dear friend here, name I shall not mention, need not mention, and shall not. But we were at the Museum of the Bible, located just a stone's throw, if you've got a really strong arm, but near here. It's about a mile or two away at most. And there in the Museum of the Bible on the wall, they had this huge painting of what were called liberators. And there was the word liberators under the picture, the painting. And they showed liberators. One of the liberators was Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, I think he qualifies as a liberator. But here's something that will offend a lot of my colleagues. It will offend a lot of my colleagues to know that one of the liberators at the Museum of the Bible was John Brown. You see, we've been taught in this country that John Brown was a murderer. John Brown was a liberator. People were enslaved. John Brown sought and fought to liberate people from slavery. A liberator. We revere the enslavers who murdered, killed, kidnapped, raped. We revere them. We pay tribute to them. But to the persons who were the victims of the kidnapping, murder, rape, we revile them. And anybody that tried to help them. John Brown was a liberator. This is over at the Museum of the Bible. I beg that you would go over there, dear brothers and sisters. One race, that's the human race. We're all related. I love you. But you've got to be told the truth. Go to the museum and see it for yourself. Nat Turner was a liberator. Liberators. Go over and view this for yourselves. Nat Turner's name was not among those. I don't want to mislead you, but he was a liberator as well. The point is, we have a duty, a responsibility, and an obligation to ourselves, members, to do justice, to demonstrate that, yes, we've come a long way and we're going to go the rest of the way. Yes, we have a Juneteenth. We need a Slavery Remembrance Day that's been acknowledged by the Senate, signed into law by the President. This House has already taken one step. We need that. But we also need to accord dignity and respect to the enslaved people. And you do that. And one way of doing it with this is with the Congressional Gold Medal to them, just as we've done it for the enslavers. I am of the opinion that we in this House, I know we can do it, but it hasn't happened, and I've indicated to you that it probably won't. But I'm going to keep hope alive. I'll be back to remind us again and again and again. I don't know that the reminder is sufficient. I'm going to use prayer, and we'll find out if we have 290 people in this house who have the courage and the heart to just sign their names so that we can do for the enslaved what we did for the enslavers. Dear friends, I love the words of Maya Angelou. She indicates in these words, perhaps I might not quote her exactly, but she indicates, bringing the gifts my ancestors gave, bringing the gift my ancestors gave. I am the dream and hope of the slave. The dream and hope of the slave. I stand here in the Congress of the United States of America knowing that somebody, some centuries ago, prayed for a day when they would receive the dignity and respect God accords all human beings as a birthright. dignity and respect of liberty and justice for all, as we have placed in our Pledge of Allegiance. Dignity and respect, that's all. That's all we're indicating we should have, dignity and respect. Now, as I bring this to a close, dignity and respect would also require that the name of Richard Russell, dear friends, was a man who fought anti-lynching legislation, fought civil rights legislation, co-authored the Southern Manifesto. Richard Russell was a white supremacist, self-proclaimed. Richard Russell said this is a white man's country. And by the way, there's some Richard Russells alive today, by the way. He wasn't the last Richard Russell. But this Richard Russell said this is a white man's country, and he wanted to keep it that way. It's Richard Russell. Now, this Richard Russell has his name on a building, the Senate Russell Office Building. Richard Russell, the white racist. His name is on a building. Is it asking too much to remove Richard Russell's name from the building? We haven't named any buildings John Brown or Nat Turner. And by the way, I'm not asking that this building be named John Brown or Nat Turner, but we haven't done it. No taxpayer dollars go toward a building being named John Brown. But we have a building named in honor of Richard Russell, a white supremacist. I don't think tax dollars ought to support a building that honors a white supremacist. The Senate is a place of shame. The building is a symbol of national shame. Senators can change this. Senators can change this almost overnight. All they have to do is remove his name. The Senate has the power. The Senate has the authority to take Richard Russell's name off of the Russell Senate Office Building. They haven't done it. They tell me some that, well, if we did it, we'd have to have another name, and we can't agree on a name. So we keep the name of the bigot on the building because we don't have another name. By the way, I haven't said name it Martin Luther King. I haven't said name it Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman. I haven't said name it John Brown, Nat Turner. Here's what I've said. I've said remove his name and let the name become what it was before it was the Russell Senate Office Building. It was called the Old Senate Office Building. Revert back to the Old Senate Office Building and take as much time as you like to develop a process, if you like, and then a name, or a name that is suitable for the building. But the excuse of we can't take it off because we can't agree on a name, that's shameful. And every senator over there ought to be ashamed. I don't go in the Richard Russell Office Building. I'm a one-person protest. I'm not going to demean myself. I have enough respect and dignity for myself not to go into a building named in honor of a racist and a bigot. I'm not going to do it. And those who do it, well, it's your choice. But if you don't have to, you're disrespecting yourself. I have written a letter to various organizations. I was invited to come and speak over in the building for various reasons. And I've written a letter I'm sending it to all of the human rights, civil rights organizations, letting them know that I'm a one-person protest and I won't be going into the Senate Russell office building, except to protest. There is an exception. I will go into protest, and I will be going into protest, so I'm giving everybody fair notice. There will be protestation at the Russell office building. I won't say when, but I will be going to protest. But I'm hopeful that we can take the name of Richard Russell off of the Senate office building, paid for with tax dollars. Easy to do, but difficult if you don't have the courage, if you don't have the integrity, and if you don't have the heart to do what's right. Now, here's what I suspect will happen at some point. At some point, my brothers and sisters in the Senate will find a way to do this and ignore the fact that I have been standing in this house appealing to them to do it. Because you see, people are written out of history who make these kinds of demands. Written out of history. Because it can never be said that a person of African ancestry had the courage to do this and then it was done. Well, that would mean then that there are other things that people of color might have the courage to do to get done in a similar fashion. So they'll find a clever way to get it done, and the name will change, and we'll just go on as though none of this ever happened. But I just pray that the record will show that someone came to this well and stood for justice. Just as we like to record the history of all of the things that other people do, let it be known that at least one person came here and asked that we take that name off of that building. It will happen. It's just a matter of time. At some point, there'll be people who are going to coalesce around this, and the Senate will have to do it. It's shameful that they haven't done it, but they'll have to do it. And at some point, there will be, maybe not while I'm here, but this Congress is going to award a quarter Congressional Gold Medal to those persons who suffered slavery. The Congress will do it, but they have to find a way to do it so that it doesn't look like they were forced to do it, that they were forced by a person, a black man who had the courage to come and stand in the well and say, this is something that we must do. They can't let it seem as though this person did this. So they'll find a way to do these things, and it will be as though none of this ever happened. But you know what? The good news is that it will happen. Maybe not in time for me to see it, but it will happen. So, Mr. Speaker, I thank you for the time. I am proud to say that I love my country, Mr. Speaker, in spite of the way my country has behaved. I still love it. It's sort of like a mother or father loving children. Sometimes children don't behave properly, but you don't cease to love them. You want to correct them. So I come here to correct my country and help us to do the right thing. Actually, more important than that, Mr. Speaker, to do the righteous thing. To do the righteous thing. I love my country, and I pray that my country will do the righteous thing. Mr. Speaker, I thank you for the time, and I'm proud to yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Does the gentleman